2017 was a really crappy year for a lot of things. Thankfully, my favorite genre of movies wasn't one of them, as 2017 gave us without a doubt the strongest batting average of superhero movies ever in a given year. Not everyone liked everything, but the consistency with which we were given hit after hit after hit from the spandex crowd is something to be commended. So, of course, my head had to go to a list place. Fair warning, my list is not going to be your list. I happen to know for a fact that my bottom and top choices are going to draw a lot of ire, or at the very least raised eyebrows. Give your own lists in the comments as well as thoughts on this video, and with that said, let's begin. This is my worst to best superhero films of 2017.
How many of you are there? Not enough.
What really needs to be said about this movie? Well, by me, everything, since I never got around to giving it a proper review. Justice League is a movie so inconsequential in so many ways that it's honestly kinda baffling to me that I live in a world where it exists. Like, how is it that in a film landscape so utterly dominated by superheroes, the vast majority of which are owned between two companies, one of those companies finally gets a film dedicated to their flagship superhero team, a modern theistic pantheon if there ever was one, featuring three of the most recognizable characters in fictional history, and that same movie is ultimately just an okay at best, generic, dismissible action flick. Now, I know some of you, especially those who don't even like comic book movies and by extension probably shouldn't be watching this video, are going to say that generic and dismissible are the defining traits of Justice League's competition, but that especially is what I find kinda hilarious. Justice League is what happens when a studio tries their darndest to ape the work of a rival who they've clearly always had a rather condescending view toward, i.e. someone trying to pivot from DC's approach to movies up to now and make a Marvel film because they know those are profitable, but at the same time having zero inkling of what actually makes those movies resonate. As a result, Justice League is best comparable to a Marvel movie born from people who really do think that lighthearted quips, a colorful palette, and some action is all that goes into those movies. No one in Justice League has a substantial arc, the actual formation of the team feels obligatory rather than natural, the villain honestly could have been a chunk of cardboard with the words bad guy written on it, and the attempts at humor largely fall flat because hardly any of it is coming from characters I'm actually invested in. Most of it, in fact, is coming from Ezra Miller, who is an actor I've decided I plain do not like and is easily the worst thing about the film. The guy just never looks like he's comfortable on screen, and not in a good, informed by character way. I feel like a lot of the Flash's jokes could actually work on paper if they were delivered by someone with a bit more charisma, but this guy just doesn't have it. Aquaman and Cyborg leave no impression. The characterization of both Batman and Superman feels like a desperate attempt to pull a 180 from BVS and make them both as safe as possible. And while for Superman it kind of works, for Batman it really doesn't. The movie as a whole is the only film on this list that I think is downright bad, and the fallout of its critical and financial stumbling would be something to behold if it wasn't just the usual state of affairs at Warner Brothers right now. This was a movie that clearly had no sense of confidence behind it from the studio, and these characters, actors, and directors deserved better.
Oh, listen to that. He's threatening me. Hey, Sparkles, here's the deal. If you want to get back to place, Asperg,
Asgard!
any contender who defeats my champion, their freedom they shall win.
Alright, good movie territory at last. I've actually seen this movie a second time since doing both of my videos on it, and man, should I have waited before making those because this movie worked way better for me on a second watch. The fact that it's still this low on the list speaks less to its flaws and more to how good everything else is. My reaction to the humor was generally unchanged from my first viewing, but boy did I pick up on a lot more interesting character beats and thematic elements this time. It even manages to almost completely fix my issues with Odin. Congratulations, OD, you're no longer the most mishandled character in the MCU. I still have one major complaint with Ragnarok, and that's Thor's relationship with Bruce Banner, which has a proper setup, but isn't given anything in the way of meaningful closure, even as both character arcs reach a conclusion. Outside of that, pretty much everything about the film worked better for me than it did before. That's pretty sad for me because it makes the hours and hours that I sunk into my two previous videos now obsolete, but hey, I got a more engaging, interesting, and at times even powerful experience, and I can't be too mad about that. Can't wait to see this one a third time.
Do I get a costume for the mission too?
I got a feeling that you'll just look like a kid on Halloween, don't you think? Don't touch that.
called Mariachi.
I like that one.
That one is culturally insensitive.
So an honest-to-God toy commercial is the best movie in a decade to feature Batman in a starring role, who would have thought? After years and years and years of the mainstream culture refusing to let Batman be anything but a symbol of self-importance and dourness, this movie manages to build itself entirely around a scathing critique of that mentality. This is a movie that reminds us, hey, maybe it's okay for Batman to have friends. Hey, maybe it's okay if we don't all the time worship Batman as such an amazing pillar of awesomeness, who's just so cool and dark and better than everyone. Maybe it's okay for Robin and Batgirl and the more colorful, overtly goofy villains and stuff to be in a movie. Maybe it's okay for Batman to be a role model for kids again. Maybe we should stop trying to edge Batman so close to the line of morality just because it sells well that he becomes indistinguishable from a bad guy. This is a refreshing and at times genuinely insightful look at the nature and status of one of the most popular characters on the planet, and a gorgeously animated and funny kids movie, and a truly heartfelt father-son story. It has one of the better post-Ledger takes on the Joker, which in itself is a thinly veiled metaphor for just how far some writers take the relationship between jokes and Batman, and it was definitely the best Lego movie to come out this year. There are one or two jokes that fall flat, but that's pretty much all I have to complain about. Yes, it's a comedy bordering on complete farce. Yes, it's the only film on this list directed specifically at children. Sorry, Captain Underpants, you were great, but I don't count you. But I still think it deserves to be here, and if you haven't given it a chance yet, you owe it to yourself. Getting this out of the way now, I actually think Wonder Woman might have more substantial problems than Lego Batman does. Specifically the third act, for as much as it works thematically, can't escape the fact that it's still very visually noisy, a bit too cheesy in the bad way, and is centered around a villain that's only marginally better than Steppenwolf in the big dumb grey living Cypher area. Thankfully, Wonder Woman is so flippin' amazing prior to that point that it more than makes up for it. Diana of Themyscira is the MVP of the entire DC Extended Universe, and one of the most endearing main characters in any superhero film. There is just no artifice with her. Everything is completely genuine and kind and just, and the embodiment of what our ideal of the superhero should be. The supporting cast is all charming and interesting and diverse, and Steve Trevor is one of those, oh right, I keep forgetting how good of an actor this guy actually is, reminders for Chris Pine. Let's be real though, the moment that encapsulates this entire film is the No Man's Land sequence, which is no exaggeration, likely to go down as an all-time iconic cinema moment. Honestly, that whole scene in the immediately following action sequence is the highlight of not just this film, but this entire franchise. And it leaves one wondering if maybe a mind like Patty Jenkins isn't what every DC film needs. It feels kinda weird to me to have this movie this far down, even on a list that I readily admit is incredibly close and made up almost entirely of greats. If it just weren't for the pesky third act issues and occasionally obnoxious bouts of slow motion getting in the way, this would probably be number one. It's just that emblematic of everything that should be about superhero fiction. The success of this film as it pertains to being a good omen for the franchise was unfortunately blunted by Justice League, but no matter what chaos ensues over at Warner Brothers, we can all rest assured that Wonder Woman 2 is happening, and that at least one truly spectacular thing came out of this whole mess. Speaking of spectacular...
Thanks, Karen. It's really nice to have somebody to talk to. Hey, how long we been here anyways?
37 minutes.
What? 37 minutes? That's insane!
The more I think about this placement, the more I have to remind myself that part of what I love about the genre is its capacity for variety. I just got done gushing about what I consider in many ways a definitive superhero movie, one that was existentially hopeful in a way unlike anything else on this list, and it's still one step below a movie that's basically just a high school comedy coming-of-age story, but done really well. Granted, Peter Parker is totally as endearing as Wonder Woman, and as another film that skews younger, Homecoming makes its protagonist grow into a real role model. Tom Holland has quickly become a lot of people's favorite Spider-Man, and it's easy to see why. I'll stop just short of calling this take on the character definitive as a whole, just because there's so much to mainline comic Spider-Man that would be impossible to capture in this movie's context, but darn it if I'm not going to call this the definitive theatrical take for me. Peter's got a compelling journey, along with a colorful supporting cast who bounce off each other great, The idea that I have to wait at least another 2 years to see Jacob Batalon or Zendaya in these roles is killing me, and we've got easily one of Marvel's best villains in Adrian Toomes, and that's coming at a time when their batting average with villains is getting pretty consistently good. Speaking of colorful, I just love this movie's use of color. It really puts you in the headspace of a starstruck kid who just doesn't see the world of superheroing as gray or dire as the adults do. My biggest complaint is still that I can't think of any particularly great action scenes. It's kind of funny, but of the now 6 Spider-Man movies, I think half of them have some pretty rad and memorable action sequences, while the other 3 are just, serviceable. The most tense and memorable action sequence of the film is one where Spider-Man isn't even fighting anyone, actually. But if my biggest complaint about a movie is that the whiz-bang-pow stuff could be better, I think that's generally a good sign. Story first, after all. Speaking of which...
Guys, seriously, you don't want to do this.
Take them out.
This has gotta be the least whiz-bang-pow superhero movie ever made. Many would argue that it's not even a superhero movie, even though the tropes of superheroics are what this entire film is built around. That means both the aspirational stuff, like inspiring and protecting future generations, but also the questionable stuff, like solving every problem with violence. Logan is a lot of things in a lot of ways, but one thing I don't think it is a condemnation of or an attempt to distance from the idea of the superhero. What it is Hugh Jackman's finest performance as the titular character, a marvelous introduction to both a great new character and a great new talent in the form of Daphne Keane as Laura. Seriously, the very high likelihood that Miss Keane will never play this role again is the biggest tragedy of Disney reacquiring the rights to X-Men specifically. And a bittersweet but ultimately appropriate swan song for the characters who have pretty much carried the X-Men film franchise on their backs for nearly 2 decades. It's also just a really, really well-directed movie. If I was someone who had any pretense about this list being quote-unquote objective, I'd probably smack myself for not having this at number 1, since it's probably the best example of outright filmmaking craft. James Mangold directed the previous Wolverine solo film, and while Logan doesn't remotely feel the need to function as a sequel to that movie, or really any movie in the X-Men line to its credit, it does feel like Mangold got to refine a lot of the ideas tackled in The Wolverine and do them more justice. Logan makes sure you know just how much it sucks to be the titular character. And while I think the movie ultimately comes down on superheroes as a good thing, its biggest strength is in refusing to let anything about Logan or what he does seem remotely cool. Even in the way that most stories about tortured, brooding loners feel the need to make that seem at least a little bit cool on an aesthetic surface level, no, Logan's life isn't good to look at. It's not dynamic. The coolest thing about him since his character's inception, i.e. the claws, seemed like they would be an outright pain to have for the first time. Everything about everything in this movie is just pain. This is not a film to sit down and watch if you want a good time, but I think we all know that at this point. The simple fact that this movie exists is a testament to what you can do with superheroes, be that grounded or heightened, even if they're already established characters. It's one of the best films I saw last year, but it's not my favorite.
He thinks you want him to wear it as a hat.
That's not what I said.
I'm Groot.
He's relieved you don't want him to.
I'm Groot.
He hates hats.
I'm Groot.
On anyone, not just himself.
I'm Groot.
One minute you think someone has a weird-shaped head, the next minute just because you realize part of that head is a hat. That's why you don't like hats?
You want to talk the complete opposite of Logan in nearly every way? Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is that in spades. Where Logan is grounded, this movie is as out there as these films get. Where Logan is depressing, bordering on humorless, Guardians is comedic to the point of immaturity on several occasions. Where Logan left me sitting in the theater feeling like a dried-up husk from which no emotion could escape, in a good way, Volume 2 left me sobbing my eyes out not once but twice. No comic book movie has ever done that to me before. What the two movies have in common is that they both feel like refinements of their predecessors. Volume 2 is, to me, a lot of the ideas in Guardians 1 done way better than they were in that film. Exploring the varying levels of emotional maturity in all of its characters, along with the downright twisted family dynamic of nearly everyone involved, looking at even more of the candy-colored cosmos, the sequel also just ups the ante on all the things that matter. Ego is a great villain, not the best even on this list, granted, but he's a perfect mix of charming, funny, a bit scary, and downright despicable. He's bad enough that he effectively turned my mom against Kurt Russell by proxy of the character's actions. And let me tell you, that takes a lot. This family has been next to Kurt Russell during some dark, dark times. Something else that sticks out about this movie is just how inventive and well-paced the action can be. Before we get a kinda standard but still fun to look at apocalyptic climax, the movie's action scenes are all visually and contextually unique, and spaced out well enough that the action never threatens to overrun the story and characters. It's a bit hard to properly articulate, but I just love the way that the action scenes are placed across the movie. Speaking of the characters though, everything about this movie, action included, is in the service of them and their growth. There's a wonderful video out there by Lindsay Ellis about the character dynamics and themes of this film, but I love the way that Volume 2 takes a whole cast of breakout characters from Film 1 and makes them even better by totally throwing out any kind of artifice. Again, just like Wonder Woman, the movie is concerned with the characters being genuine. And again, like Logan, we tear down or at least poke some holes in characters' cool factor and leave them feeling more like real people. They were all emotionally stunted and socially maladjusted already, but it was mostly played for laughs before. Here it is still funny, but it's more than just a joke that the two badass stoic assassin sisters are more like moody estranged teenagers, or that the funny talking raccoon is both a literal animal and a psychopath who doesn't fully comprehend friendship, or that the charming maverick man-child is truly stuck in an emotional place that he should have long grown out of. The core Guardians were already sold hard by the first movie, but Volume 2 takes characters like Yondu and Nebula, who I found underutilized, and made them leagues more interesting. The idea that general consensus on this movie is not as favorable as the first film honestly baffles me. I mean, I know the first movie had novelty going for it, and no film is perfect. There's one scene in particular that I feel is outright cheating, and the Sovereign are a bit too broadly drawn and purely plot devices for the amount of screen time that they get, but of all the comic book films I saw last year, this one hit me hardest and stuck with me the most. It's my second or third favorite film of 2017 as a whole, and there's no way I wasn't gonna put it at the top of this list. As I said earlier, I have no doubt that your list would be different from mine, so if you're into that sort of thing, feel free to comment with your own rankings. Here's to 2018 keeping the gravy train rolling, and hopefully bringing us a crop of superhero movies that's just as good as last year's.